B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Yevamot Daf Ches. We're going to start 12 lines from the top of the Amud. And we'll all remember we're in the middle of this long sugya which started on Daf Gimel, that there's a special word in the Torah, Oleha, that teaches us that if besides for the Isser of Eishes Ach, of doing Yibum, which is when Shimon dies without children, his brother Reuven does Yibum, marries Shimon's widow, besides for that normally being an erva of Eishes Ach, a brother's wife, which is seriously and severely asa, in the case of Yibum says, here it's a mitzvah to marry her. If besides for that Isser, there's any other erva that woman has, for example, that Shimon's widow is also a sister of Reuven's wife, which is one of the 15 aroyes, or a daughter of Reuven, which is another one of the 15, or any of the 15 mentioned in the Mishnah on Daf Beis, in that case we do not do Yibum. And then the Gemara has been discussing since Daf Gimel, why do I need a special pasuk to say that you don't do Yibum? Why would we have entertained the idea of doing Yibum to an erva? Obviously besides for Eishes Ach, which is the essence of Yibum. And the Gemara tried to say that Asei Doichelois Aseh, and then Asei Doichelois Aseh Sheesh Beikoros, and then a Dover Shahoyo Bechlal V'yotzo Min HaKlal, and then a Memotzinu, and then Hoyel v'Ishtari. Ishtari, we saw that on Daf Zayin Amud Beis and the top of Daf Ches Amud Aleph, that in a specific circumstance, then we would use the concept of Hoyel v'Ishtari. Ishtari that wants a person with an Isser, which is on him, for example, Eishes Ach, has been overridden by a mitzvah, then even though there's an additional Isser attached to him, we'll override that as well, but only in a very specific circumstance that we discussed in the previous shiur. And now the Gemara is going to give a sixth suggestion as to why we would need a pasuk, the word oleha, to say that you don't do Yibum if there's one of the 15 aroyos. V'iboyes ema, if you want, you can explain that asya behekesha, because there's a hekesh. And the hekesh means that we would compare these 15 aroyos to an erva, which does get overridden, and once you have a hekesh, we would think that in the same way as one erva is overridden, so too all the others are overridden. And therefore I need a special pasuk to say, don't do Yibum. Mid Rabbi Yoina, Da'omer Rabbi Yoina, V'yitei Rav Huna b'rei Rabbi Yeshua, Omer Kro, it says in the pasuk, Ki chol ha'sheyaseh mikol ha'to'evos ha'ele. Anybody who transgresses any of these abominations, these aroyos, v'nichrasu hanafoshes ha'osos mikerev amam, then the people who are engaged in this avera, of having relations, of marrying one of the aroyos, then they get chorus. So you see that there's a generalization, that there's something that's putting all the aroyos into a single bracket, and that's this pasuk that says kol hashetaz yaseh mikol ha'to'evos ha'ele. So you see that hukshu kol aroyos kulam le'eishes ach. So here you see that all the aroyos are put into the same bundle, so to speak, and one of the aroyos, and it is an erva in a regular circumstance, is Eishes Ach, marrying a brother's wife, a deceased brother's wife. And since all aroyos are compared or are put into a single pot, so to speak, and one of them is Eishes Ach, and we know that Eishes Ach is overridden by Yibum, that's what Yibum is. Yibum says that when Shimon dies without children, his brother Reuven can marry Shimon's widow, which would normally be Eishes Ach. Ma Eishes Ach Sharia. So we say it's a hekesh in the same way as Eishes Ach is mutter. When it's a case of Yibum, Afkol aroyos nami sharion. And so too any other erva is also mutter. And therefore, kosav rachmon oleo. That's why I need a special pasuk to say that you don't do Yibum. So that is a suggestion the Gemara is giving. And now the Gemara is asking a question. Okay, granted, we compare, there's a hekesh to all the aroyos together. You suggested at first that all the aroyos should be compared and similar to Eishes Ach, and therefore they should all be mutter. So then you have the pasuk of Oleha, which is a pasuk that's written by the erva of Achois Isha, the erva of a sister of a wife. If Shimon was married to Reuven's wife's sister, and there it says Oleo, that even in the case of Yibum, you're not allowed to marry Achois Isha, and that's the source that if there's any of the aroyos, that if Shimon's wife is osir as any erva other than Eishes Ach, you don't do Yibum. But where does the Torah actually write that? By Achois Isha, by the sister of a wife. And then we say that in the same way, and we saw this on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, that we say that now we have a hekesh, and we say that all the other aroyes in those 15 aroyes are now all compared and similar to the Achois Isha, then the same way as Achois Isha does not get overridden by Yibum, so too does none of the aroyes in our Mishnah get overridden by Yibum. And the Gemara is going to ask, the same hekesh of all the aroyes that we just saw, all the aroyes are similar. So it's possible to say that they're all similar to Eishesach, which is mutter. Eishesach gets overridden by Yibum. And you can also compare them all to Achois Isha, where the Pasuk says Oleha, from where we learn that you don't do Yibum. Why are you using the Hekesh to say that all the other 14 of the 15 aroyes are similar to Achois Isha, which is also to do Yibum? Why don't you say that they're all similar to Eishesach, where you do Yibum? Says the Gemara, I'll give you one answer. Lekula v'chumra l'chumra makshinon. Whenever you can use a hekesh, either lekula, either with a leniency or with a stringency, l'chumra makshinon, we use the hekesh l'chumra. Another suggested answer is because there's something similar between all the aroyos and Achois Isha more than all the aroyos to Eishesach. Because Hacha Trei Yisura, V'Hacha Trei Yisura. Achois Isha has two issues. We've already seen this concept earlier on, that all the 15 aroyos, really they're all Eishesach. There is an erva of not marrying a deceased brother's wife. And so all the aroyas, besides them, any case of Yibum would be Eishesach. Besides for that, it's also another erva. It's either a daughter of Reuven or a sister of his wife, or any of the other aroyas. There's two isurim. V'hacha trei isura, that means Achois Isha, as well as any of the other aroyas, is always two ervas. There's Eishesach plus the other erva. Utrei mitrei yalfinon. So we make a hekesh and we learn out where there's a two aroyos from a case where there's two aroyos. So we compare all the other aroyos to Achois Isha. Aval hacha chod isura. But Eishesach is only a single erva. It's only Eishesach with no other issa. Utrei michod lo yalfinon. We don't compare all the other aroyos, which is two issues, to Eishesach, which is just one issa. So that was suggestion number 6, that we have a hekesh, and because there's a hekesh that we could have learnt all the aroyos to Eishesach, we therefore need oleo to say, no, you don't do Yibum by aroyos. And the Gemara sticks with that. The Gemara is not refuting that. Rava Omar. Now Rava is giving a suggestion number 7, why we would need the pasuk of oleo. Why would we have suggested to do Yibum with an erva? Rava Omar, Rava says, I actually agree with your question. And erva lo yitzricha kra. The pasuk of oleha, that it says in the context of Achois Isha, that you do not do Yibum when the woman that Reuven would be doing Yibum to is a sister of his wife. That doesn't need a pasuk, because indeed it's an erva, it's a lav sheyesh beikoros, and we would never have entertained the idea of doing Yibum. We don't need oleha for that. The mitzvah saseh of doing Yibum, we would never have thought of overriding a lo saseh sheyesh beikoros. Ki yitzchok kra. Why do we need the pasuk of oleha and litzroir lemeisar tzara? If Shimon is married to one of the aroyos of Reuven, and besides for that, Shimon's married to another woman as well, not only can Reuven not do Yibum to that erva, as we've just learned, but he also doesn't do Yibum to the rival wife, to the co-wife of Shimon, the co-wife of that erva. That's called a tzara, and we saw that in the Mishnah on Daf Beis. So I need the pasuk to tell us that he does not do Yibum even to the tzara. Says the Gemara, is that so clear to you that I don't need a pasuk of oleo to say that when there's Yibum and besides for Eishesach there's another erva that you don't do Yibum? Is that clear that you take that for granted and there's no pasuk? V'tanya, did we not learn in a brisa, and we saw this brisa on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, that the brisa says Ein li Elohi, that we have a source that Achois Isha, you don't do Yibum, you learn it from the pasuk, and the brisa says, how do you learn the tzoros? How do you learn other aroyos? But it says there clearly, Ein li Elohi. I have the pasuk to tell us that that woman, that Achois Isha, doesn't do Yibum. So you see clearly you need a pasuk that Achois Isha doesn't do Yibum. Answers the Gemara, Mishum Tzarasa. I only need the pasuk not really for the Achois Isha herself, but because the Brisa continues to say that also the Tzara, the co-wife of this Achois Isha, also not, so you have to learn that the Issa of Eishes Ach, which and Achois Isha, which prevents Yibum from happening, is not only to the Erva but also to the Tzara. Because the Tzara in and of herself, there's no issue. That second wife of Shimon is not an Erva in and of herself, is not an Erva to Reuven, besides for Eishes Ach, which is overridden by Yibum. So you need to say that since she's a Tzara of a different Erva, that's why you don't do Yibum with her either. So that's why you first mention that you don't do Yibum to the other Erva. Says the Gemara, okay, so you need that part of the Brisa for the Tzara. V'oktani, but if you continue further on down the Brisa, it says, Ein li elo hein, mishum tzara, ein li elo hein, that we see that the Brisa continues and says that all the other 15 aroyas, the other 14 or 15 besides V'achois Isha, we have as pasuk to tell us that they also, you don't do Yibum, not only Achois Isha. So again you see in the Brisa that there's a pasuk to tell us that the other aroyas, you don't do Yibum. And the Gemara says here again, the Brisa only said it Mishum Tzarisen, because the next step in that Brisa is to tell us the tzoros of all those other aroyas, and therefore we first make it clear that the other aroyas also you don't do Yibum, but we don't actually need the pasuk to tell us that those other aroyas you don't do Yibum. Continues the Gemara, Tashema, Rabbi Omer, and we're going to learn about this Rabbi a little bit more later in the Gemara. Rabbi, he's got a different source than the Brisa on Daf Gimel, where we said you learn out from Oleha and Litzroir. Rabbi says, I've got a different pasuk to say that one does not do Yibum with one of the 15 aroyas or the tzoros of one of the 15 aroyas, because it says in the pasuk, Ki yeshu achim yachtav umeis echad mehem, uvein ein lo sia eshes hameis hachutza, leish zar, yevoma yovoy oleh, ulekacha. He takes her, loy leisha, as a wife, v'yibmo, and he does Yibum to her. And really it could have written v'lokach and v'yibim. The extra hey of v'lokcha and the extra hey of v'yibma seems to be superfluous. So Rabbi says the fact that it could have said v'lokach and it says v'lokcha, it could have said v'yibim and it says v'yibma, is to tell us le'asir tzoros, to tell us that the tzoros don't do Yibum, v'aroyis, and the Erva themselves doesn't do Yibum. Do you not see clearly from the term, from the formula of Rabbi, that he says that tzoros need a pasuk and aroyos need a pasuk? Did Rava not just tell us now that the fact that the other aroyos don't do Yibum does not need a pasuk? Answers the Gemara, what Rabbi actually meant was Eima le'aser tzoros shel aroyos. What he meant to say is that I need these psukim that to tell us that the tzoros of the aroyos don't do Yibum, but that the aroyos themselves don't do Yibum, as Rava said, we don't need a pasuk. Says the Gemara, when Rabbi brings two words in the pasuk, he brings v'lokcha and v'yibma. Two words, my love, can we not assume chad le'erva v'chad le'tzara? I need one to say that the erva doesn't do Yibum and one to say that the tzaras erva doesn't do Yibum. And again, it's not like Rava who said that the erva itself doesn't need a pasuk. Says the Gemara, loy, you shouldn't assume that. Idi v'idi le'tzara. I need both of these words to teach us about the halachas of the tzara. Chad, one of them, that's the v'lokcha l'meisar tzara b'mkoim mitzvah. That the tzara, where it's b'mokim mitzvah. Okay, let's just read the words and then we'll explain. V'chad l'mishri tzara sheloi b'mokim mitzvah. And we already saw this concept on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. The word tzara means a rival wife, a co-wife. So we've been learning here in this perek about a tzara of Yibum. If Shimon is married to a woman who is also an erva to Shimon's brother Reuven, and also married to a different wife, which is a tzara to that woman, then Reuven not only does he not do Yibum to the erva, but also not to the tzara. Okay, but the concept of tzara could apply elsewhere, not within the concept of Yibum. What happens if you've just got a regular man? Somebody married Don. Don married a woman who was a sister of Reuven's wife. There's nothing wrong with that. And then Don has another wife. And then Don dies. And is now Reuven allowed to marry Don's second wife? The co-wife of his wife's sister? That's called a tzara, a tzoras erva shalei b'mokim mitzvah. There's no concept of yibum. If Don dies with children, without children, there's no yibum because Don is not a brother of Reuven. But he's got a wife who was a tzoras erva to Reuven. That's called a tzara shalei b'mokim mitzvah. Is Reuven allowed to marry that tzara? The Gemara now says yes. So I need two psukim. One, I need the pasuk of a lokcha to say that you can do yibum, but not to a tzara. When it's, in the case of Yibum, Tzoras Erva is Asa, but I need the word Vayibma to say that it's only in the concept of Yibum. In the context of Yibum, you don't do Yibum even to a Tzoras Erva, but only in the context of Yibum. If it's Shaloibim Koi Mitzvah, then the concept of Tzoras Erva is not an issue. The Mishri, Tzora Shaloibim Oki Mitzvah, a Tzora, not in the case of Mitzvahs Yibum, is Mutter. Reuven's allowed to marry a woman that was a rival wife, was a co-wife with one of his aroyos. Says the Gemara, Maitama, what would be the source in these words of Velokcha and Vayibma? How would we learn from there that Tzoras Erva b'mokim mitzvah is Aser and Shaloi b'mokim mitzvah is Mutter? Because it says Vayibim Vayibma. What do you learn from the word Vayibma? That only b'mokim yibum hu da'asira tzara. Only in the context of mitzvahs yibum, then tzara is aser. But shaloi b'mokim yibum, but not in the case of yibum, sharia tzara, the tzara is mutter. Omer Rav Ashi says that masnisin nami daika. If we look carefully at the wording in our Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, it also seems to say, like Rav is saying, that we don't need a source to say that the erva herself cannot do yibum to Reuven, and the whole chiddush of the Mishnah is the tzoras erva, and you only need a pasuk for tzoras erva. Diktoni. Because we said in the Mishnah, Chomesh Esrei Noshim, these 15 aroyos, poitrois tzoriseim, they exempt their tzoris of doing yibum. V'ilu, and however, it doesn't say pturois, that these 15 aroyos themselves don't do yibum, upoitrois, and they exempt their tzoris. Loikatoni doesn't say that. Shma Mina, so from the wording in the Mishnah, it also seems that the pturos, the fact that the ervas themselves don't do yibum, that can be taken for granted. The whole chiddush, and we only need a pasuk for that, is to tell us that tzoras erva also cannot do yibum. Continues the Gemara. Umayshno erva deloy tzricha. We're going now back to Rava. Rava said that an erva of Reuven, if Shimon was married to an erva of Reuven, that Reuven does not do yibum to that erva, one of the 15 arayos in our Mishnah, doesn't need a pasuk. We saw extensively earlier on that the asay of yibum does not override a lois aseh sheyesh beikoros. So we say, and we don't need a pasuk to say that you don't do yibum. Tzara nami. In the case of the tzara, where we already learned from the word litzroir, as we saw on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, that litzroir says that when it comes to achos isha, not only can you not do yibum to the achos isha, which is one of the aroyos, but also to do a litzroir, a tzara of the achos isha, is also included as one of the aroyos, and you do not do yibum. So once I know from litzroir that you cannot do yibum to a tzara of achos isha, then, and the pasuk puts all the krisis together and says that all of them are chorus, well, as soon as the pasuk says in litzroir that achos isha you don't do yibum and tzoras achos isha you don't do yibum, then I already know that the mitzvah of yibum, that means once tzoras achos isha is no yibum, we automatically the chorus comes back. Once the chorus comes back, I don't need the word oleho to say don't do yibum. It's one of the arayos. And in the same way as achos isha is an erva, and you don't need a pasuk to say that you don't do yibum because an asay is not doicha lois shesh bekoros, the tzara as well. So tzara nami loy tiboyakra, then I don't need oleho to say that tzaras erva, because that's what Rabbi is suggesting. Rabbi is saying that the erva itself doesn't need a pasuk, because ein asay doicha lois shesh bekoros, but tzaras erva does. Tzaras erva also, as soon as you know that they can't do yibum from litzroir, that you cannot do yibum to the sister to achos isha, then I know you can't do yibum. I know there's a chorus there, so I don't need oleo. Because we know that nasei cannot override a lois aseh sheyesh beikoros. And the Gemara just means to ask, why do I need also litzroir and also oleho? According to Rabbi, who learns out from different psukim, v'lokcha and v'yibma is not, the question is not a question. Because of course you need a pasuk to say that you don't do Yibum with a tzara. But according to the Bryce on Daf Gimel, once you have litzro to say that there's an isikoros on for a tzaras erva, then it goes without saying you don't do Yibum, I don't need oleha. Answers the Gemara, Omale Rav Acha bar Bivi Mar L'Ravina, Hacha Ka'oma Mishmei de Rava. We're going to tweak Rava a little bit, and then this question won't be difficult. That tzara nami loy tzarich kro. The word oleha I don't need for tzara either. Because once you have litzro to tell us that you don't do Yibum with tzaras erva, and we know there's a chorus, then I don't need oleha. Ki itzrich kro, what I need the word oleha on the Torah for is actually the mishri tzara shaloi b'mokim mitzvah. I need the Bryson needs to tell us that the same way as we discussed before, if you've got tzaras erva shaloi b'mokim mitzvah, if Don, who wasn't a brother of Reuven, was married to the sister of Reuven's wife and another wife, and then Don dies, Reuven can marry the other wife, the tzaras erva, because it's shaloi b'mokim mitzvah. Where do we learn that from? That you learn from oleha. That the whole issue of tzaras erva is only an issue by Yibum and not an issue shaloi b'mokim mitzvah. Says the Gemara, my tama, where would we see it in the word oleha? Omar kro, oleha. Because it says in that pasuk, that you're not allowed to marry a sister of a wife. Reuven cannot marry his wife's sister or the tzara of his wife's sister. That means if his wife's sister and another woman were married to Shimon, but that's only oleha, but mokim oleha only when it's in the context of Yibum. Yovama yovay oleha, we learn out from this word. It's only in the context of Yibum. Huda asira. Then the tzara is aser. Shaloi b'mokim oleha, but not in the case of oleha, yevama yovay oleha. It's in the case of just a tzaras erva, nothing to do with Yibum. Shari, in that case, tzaras erva will be mutter. Says the Gemara, Omali Rami bar Choma l'Rava, Eima erva gufei shaloi b'mokim mitzvah tishtari. Once it says in the pasuk of achois isha, where it says you're not allowed to marry your wife's sister. And you're also not allowed to marry litzro, the tzara of your wife's sister. When is that? Oleha. Only in the context of Yibum. So why do you say that the wife's sister you're never allowed to marry? If it's not in the context of Yibum, we take it for granted you can't. That's when it's asa. Even in the case of Yibum, you're not allowed to. The tzara is only oleha, only in the context of Yibum. You cannot marry the tzara of achois isha, but not in the context of Yibum you can. Why? Maybe the word oleha is going on the whole issa, the whole pasuk. Not only the tzara of achois isha, maybe achois isha also is only asa in the context of Yibum, but not in the context of Yibum. Maybe you can even marry an achois isha. You can marry your wife's sister. Says the Gemara, no. V'lav kal v'chomer? Is it not a kal v'chomer? Can I not take it for granted that v'lav kal v'chomer hu b'mokim mitzvah asira, if when there is a mitzvah, I cannot marry my wife's sister? Shaloi b'mokim mitzvah, then if it's not in the context of mitzvah sharia, it should be mutter? Of course not. It cannot be that an erva is going to be more mutter when there's no mitzvah. Omale. So he said to him, no, this refutation is not a good refutation, because I'll prove to you there's a case where b'mokim mitzvah it's osir, and shaloi b'mokim mitzvah it's mutter. Where's that? Tzara toichiach, in the case of tzara. The b'mokim mitzvah asira, as we saw in our Mishnah, that when there's a mitzvah of Yibum, in the context of Yibum, a tzaras erva is asa. V'shaloi b'mokim mitzvah, but when it's not in the mokim mitzvah, sharia, we said that tzaras erva, shaloi b'mokim mitzvah, is mutter. So you see that it could be that it's mutter, shaloi b'mokim mitzvah, and b'mokim mitzvah it's asa. So maybe achois isha is the same. Maybe it's only asa b'mokim mitzvah, and shaloi b'mokim mitzvah, the whole achois isha is not asa. Omar le olecha omar cross, he answered him that because of your question, we have an explicit pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'isha lachoisa lesikach litzor legalo servasa oleo b'chayeha," which means that whenever this wife is alive, you cannot marry her sister. In any case, culture b'chayeha. In any case, with Yibum, without Yibum, you can never marry your wife's sister all the while she's alive. Says the Gemara, this word b'chayeha, which says that achois isha is asa only when the wife is alive, I need that word not to tell me that shaloi b'mkoi mitzvah is asa, rather to tell me that even after the wife dies, that there's no issa of achos isha. Achos isha is only all the while that his wife is still alive. Says the Gemara, no. To teach me that after his wife dies, you're allowed to marry achos isha. Hahu, I learned that from a different pasuk. The pasuk says, and this is the same pasuk, v'isha el achoisa, a woman and her sister, lo sikach, you shouldn't marry. So from the fact that it says v'isha el achoisa, nafka, I already learned that out. That's only also when the woman is alive together with her sister. So from there I already learn that after the wife dies, you can marry her sister. So I don't need b'chayeha for that. So I can learn from b'chayeha that kol sheb'chayeha, even shloibim koy mitzvah. Says the Gemara, no. Imi v'isha el achoisa, from v'isha el achoisa, from there I learn hava mina nisgar shoshari. I may have thought that it means not that they're both alive, it means that they're both married to you. V'isha el achoisa lo sikach means you cannot be married to a woman and that woman's sister at the same time. But if you divorced your wife, you can then marry the sister of the divorced wife. Talmud Lema, that's why it says no. That's why it says b'chayeha, to say no. As long as your wife is still alive, even though you divorced her, you cannot marry her sister. So I cannot learn from b'chayeha that shaloi b'mkoi mitzvah, it's osir, because I need the b'chayeha to say that even after the wife is divorced, you cannot marry the wife's sister. Kol sheb'chayeha, afal gavdin is garasha loy, because I need the word b'chayel to say that even after you divorced your wife, you cannot marry her sister all the while that your ex-wife is alive. So then I don't have b'chayel to tell me that. If I don't have b'chayel to tell me that, how do you know? Maybe the whole pasuk is only talking about yibum, and shaloi b'mkoi mitzvah, you can even marry achos isha. Elo omer Rav Huna bar Tachlifa mishmei de Rava. We have to tweak Rava yet again, and Rava is going to say as follows. And here we're going to use the oleho and the litzroir a bit differently. Elo omar Rav Huna bar Tachlifa mishmei de Rava. We said in the name of Rava as follows. Trei kroi ksivi. We actually have a type of a contradiction in the pasuk. Ksiv, on the one hand, it says v'isha el achoisa lo yisikach litzroir. In this pasuk, it says you cannot marry your wife's sister or a co-wife, a tzara of the wife's sister. So you see clearly that there's an issa to marry also the achos isha, also the tzaras achos isha. Uchsiv, but in the same pasuk it says the next two words, litz legalois ervasa. You're not allowed to reveal her erva, you're not allowed to marry her. It doesn't say ervasam, plural, it says ervasa, just one. T'chodem mashma, it seems just one of them is asa. Only the achos isha is asa, not the tzaras achos isha is asa. Make up your mind. Is it also litzroir, also tzaras achos isha asa, or only achos isha asa? How can we reconcile these two psukim? So how do we have to say? The b'mokei mitzvah shtei masuros, the word oleha, which we said takes us to the word Yavama Yavo Eleha, which is only in the context of Yibum. In the context of Yibum Oleha, then Shtei Masuros, the Achos Isha is Asa, and the Tzaras Achos Isha is Asa. Shaloi B'mkoi Mitzvah, but Shaloi B'mkoi Mitzvah, don't say like you suggested before that maybe Shaloi B'mkoi Mitzvah, it would be mutter to marry not only the tzaras achos isha, but even the achos isha. No, because that's why it says legaloi servosa in Loshen Yochid that he asura v'tzarasa muteres. Even though the tzaras achos isha is mutter shloi b'mkayim yibum shloi b'mkayim mitzvah, but the erva herself legaloi servosa is asa even shloi b'mkayim mitzvah. Says the Gemara, once you're based on a contradiction, first it says v'isha lachoisa lo sikoch litzreir. They're both asa, the achos isha and the tzara. And then you've got legalis hervasa that only one is asa. And you're saying in the context of oleo is yibum, why are you assuming that the oleo, the yibum, is when both are asa? And the shalobim koim mitzvah, shalobim koim yibum, only the erva is asa. Epechano, maybe the other way around. But mokim mitzvah, when it's yibum, hi asura, but tzarasa muteres. Only then the achos isha is asa and tzaras achos isha might be mutter to do yibum. Shalobim koim mitzvah, and when it's shalobim koim mitzvah, not in the context of oleho, shtein asurais. That's when you say that's when they're both asa, and it would read very well because the word oleho is actually written immediately after the words legalo servasa, which just one is asa. So why are you assuming, as we know the halacha is that bimkoi mitzvah he v'tzaraso is asura and shloi bimkoi mitzvah he asura tzaraso muteres? Maybe the other way around. Says the Gemara, no, because that would be so logical, I wouldn't need oleo for that. Imkein lo yoimar oleo. Because as soon as you have a seeming contradiction, we will take it for granted that they're both asa shloi bimkoi mitzvah, and when there's a mitzvah, the tzoras erva would be mutter. From the fact that I need a special pasuk to say oleho, to tell us that something here is only in the context of yibum, it's obviously an element of chiddush. It's obviously to teach us something you wouldn't have thought, the opposite. It's obviously to teach us that b'mokim yibum, even though it's a mitzvah, both are asa, the achois isha and the tzoras achois isha. Sheloi b'mkoim yibum, there the achois isha is asa, but the tzoras achois isha is mutter. Continues the Gemara, Omelei Rav Ashi Rav Kahana, Mimai dehai oleo le'isura. So we're learning all the time that oleho is teaching us that bimkoim yibum it's asa and shaloi bimkoim yibum it's mutter. Dilma lehatera. Maybe it's teaching us leheter. The other way around. V'hochikol marachmona, and this is what the pasuk is telling us. V'isho elachoi soloi sikach litzroir. The first part of the pasuk, which is talking about the issa of the erva achos isha and the tzara, the litzroir, loihi v'loi tzara, so that it's also to marry the erva and the tzaras erva. That's shaloi b'mokim oleo. Maybe that's shaloi b'mkoim mitzvah, then both are also. Avol b'mokim oleo. But in the case of oleo, when it's yibum, maybe shtehen mutaris. Maybe in that case, the whole pasuk doesn't apply. Both are going to be mutar, that shaloi b'mkoim mitzvah, that b'mokim, with b'mokim yibum, also the erva is mutter, and also the tzaras erva is mutter. Says the Gemara, if you're going to say that either both are asa or both are mutter, imkein legalos erva, the words legalos ervasa, which we said is a case where just one is asa, just the erva is asa, not the tzara, the choda, just one, heicha mishkachas la. When is that going to be true? Ibim koim mitzvah. If it would be talking about b'mokim mitzvah, as you're suggesting now, shtein mutaris, both will be mutar. Ishaloi b'mkoim mitzvah, and if it's not b'mkoim mitzvah, shtein asurais, both are going to be asa. And that can't be, because the Torah says that there is a case that only one of them is asa. So it must be that shaloi b'mkoim mitzvah, just the erva is asa, the tzaras erva is mutar, and b'mkoim mitzvah, both of them are asa. Continues the Gemara, and we're going to discuss Rabbi a little bit more now. Gufa. Rabbi Omer, we saw before the opinion of Rabbi, that it says in the pasuk, Yeshu achim yachtov u'meis echod mem u'bein ein loy, loy siya eshes ha'meis achutza le'izor, yavomo yovo yoleo, u'lekocho loy le'isho v'yibmo. It could have said v'lokach and it says v'lokcho. It could have said v'yibem and it says v'yibmo. Le'aser tzoris v'aroyos, and we saw this before, to teach us one of these words is, that's what it seems, we said before, Rava reads this a bit differently, but to tell us that the aroyos and tzoros erva does not do yibum. Says the Gemara, midi tzoros ksiva hacha. According to the Brayso on Daf Gimel, who learns it out from litzroir, is the word tzora. We learn that tzoras erva you don't do yibum. Where do you see here? You've got the word velokcha. You've got the word vayibmo. Where do you see from here anything to do with tzoros, to do with the co-wife of an erva? Answers that's one question. Another question, v'oid tzoris militzroir nafka. Do we not see in the Brayso before that you learn out from the word litzroir that tzoras erva is osa? Why does Rabbi need the psukim here? What's he going to do with litzroir? Answers the Gemara, litzroir, you want to know what Rabbi does with the word litzroir? He learns something else from it. Mapiklei Rabbi look Reb Shimon. And we're going to see this more at length on Daf Chof Ches Amud Beis, but just very quickly, three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven and Shimon were married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah. So Reuven was married to Rachel, Leah was married, and Shimon was married to Leah. And now Reuven died without children, and Shimon died without children. So now Reuven's widow has to do Yibum with Levi, and Shimon's widow has to do Yibum with Levi. Levi's now got to do Yibum with two widows of his two brothers. The problem is that the two are sisters. You cannot marry two sisters. So from there, in that case, Reb Shimon learns that even though normally a tzoras erva is that if you're actually married to one wife, then achos isha is an erva. And over here, it's only through Yibum, the fact that both are required to do Yibum with Levi, that they are tzoris, that it's a tzoras erva. Really, they're not tzoras erva. Shimon was only married to one sister. Reuven was only married to one sister. Levi was married to neither sister. Why can't he do Yibum with one of them? No. Since being required to do Yibum is a type of zika, it's called, is a type of kiddushin, then there's some type of comparison or some type of similarity to Achois Isha, and the other one is a tzora. Then, and because of tzoris, that means they become tzoris zu lezu with the zika. That means they two become co-wives because they are both required to do yibum, and therefore Levi cannot do yibum with either sister, not with Reuven's wife, not with Shimon's wife, and that's what you learn from Litzra. We're going to learn about more about this later. Tzora Hochaksiv, Tzora Heichaksiv, the question is, okay, so Litzra you learn for Reb Shimon's halacha. Okay, but where the question is still, in these words, V'lokcha and V'yibmo, where do you see that Tzoras Erva, you can't do Yibum? Answers the Gemara, Hochikoma. Imkein le'mikro, why doesn't it just say V'lokach, my V'lokcha? Because that's what we said. He's learning from the words, Rebbe's learning from the fact that it says V'lokcha, you take her, and doesn't just say V'lokach, and you take. V'lokcha, Kol heicha de'ika trelekuch. And the word v'lokcha means you take her over somebody else. So whenever you've got a case where you've got an option of two people to take, de'iboy nosiv hai v'iboy nosiv hai, and you can choose either one, either this one or this one, then you do yibum with one of them. Then sharia, then it's mutter and a mitzvah to do yibum. V'iloi. But however, if you cannot choose between one of the two, because one of the two is an erva, then there's no velokcha at all. Then tarvayu asirin, then you cannot do yibum with any of the wives. So you see from here that tzoras erva, you don't do yibum. That's what you learn from the word velokcha. What do you learn from the words vayibma? As we saw before, vayibma tells us that all this is only b'mokim yibum, huda asira tzara. Only in the context of yibum, if you cannot marry either wife of Shimon, then Reuven cannot marry any wife of Shimon. However, shloibim kaim yibum, but not in the context of yibum. For example, if Don, a strange person who's not a brother of Reuven, is married to Reuven's wife's sister and another wife, there he doesn't have to be able to marry any wife of Reuven to marry any wife of Reuven. It's good enough that he can only marry that second wife after Reuven dies or he divorces her, but even though he cannot marry the other wife because it's Achois Isha, and therefore Sharia Tzora, in the case of Shloibim Kai Mitzvah, Tzoras Erva is mutter. And now the Gemara is saying, V'rabonon, the Chachomim of the Brais on Daf Gimel, who learn out from Litzroir that Tzoras Erva, and from Oleo that Tzoras Erva is also Bim Kai Mitzvah and mutter Shloibim Kai Mitzvah, Hai V'lokcha Mai Ovdele, what do they do with this extra letter, the extra hey in V'lokcha? Rabbi used it to tell us that in the case of Yibum, you can only do Yibum if you could marry any of the two wives. But if you cannot marry one wife because it's an Erva, Tzoras Erva is also Asa. But the Rabbanon learned this from Litzroir. Rabbi can't learn it out from Litzroir because he learns from Litzroir the halacha of Reb Shimon. Answers the Gemara, Miboye Lahu, look at Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina. Domer Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina. Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, what does he learn from the word V'lokcha? Melamed shemegarsha beget. That umachzira. V'lokcha means that this is a he takes her and it's a wife. In all halachas, it's a wife. It's a regular wife, which means that if he wants to divorce her, he doesn't need to do chalitza to her, like you would do with yibum. If a man doesn't want to do yibum, he does chalitza instead. But once he's married her, it's his wife completely. And if he wants to terminate the marriage, he does it with a regular get. And not only that, umachzira, he can even, there's a mitzvah that if somebody divorces his wife and that wife has not married somebody else in the meantime, there's a mitzvah, lahachzir grushosoi, he can remarry his original wife. So I may have entertained the idea of thinking that since this wife, there was a mitzvah to marry her because it was yibum, but now that he's divorced her, we still remember that this woman was once Shimon's wife. It's Eishesach. So maybe after the mitzvah of Yibum has been done and that marriage was terminated, now the Issa Eishesach is in place and you cannot marry her again. No, Umachzira, he can marry her again. That's what V'lokcha means. It has all the halachas of a regular wife. V'yibma, what do they do with the hey of the word V'yibma? To tell us V'yibma that he can do Yibum al Korcha even if he does it somewhat forcefully, once he's had relations with her, that he's done the mitzvah of Yibum. The Rabbi. So now that we know that from V'lokcha and V'yibma we learn these two halachas, one that Megarsha beget umachzira, and one that you can do Yibum even al korcha, then Rabbi, who uses V'lokcha and V'yibma to teach us tzara, bimkei mitzvah and shloi bimkei mitzvah, how does he know these two halachas? Answers the Gemara, Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina. The halacha of Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina that he's Megarsha beget umachzira, he learns that out from the words mi la'isha. When it says in the pasuk, he takes it as a wife. You learn from there that not from the word lekacha that it's a taking like a wife. You learn out from leisha that it's like a wife. Nafka, he learns it from there. Al korcha, how does he learn al korcha? Not from the hay of Yibma, rather from Yevama, from a pasuk that says Yevama Yovayoleo Nafka. He learns out from the Yevama Yovayoleo. He can have relations with her, even if it's bal korcha, even if there's an element of that she doesn't want it. If he had relations with her and he married her, then he's fulfilled the mitzvah of Yibum. And in Yitzchok Hashem, in the next Shiur, we're going to continue what's Rabbi going to do with Oleho. Because the Rabbanon learn out from Oleho, as we've seen till now, that an Erva and Tzoras Erva is Osir Bimkei Mitzvah. Shaloi Bimkei Mitzvah, the Erva is Osir, and Tzoras Erva is Mutter. But Rabbi learns this out from V'lokcha and V'yibma. What's he going to do with Oleho? We're going to learn that in the next Shiur in Yitzchok Hashem.